There is a particular sort of Oxford rain that does not fall so much as linger, as though it has forgotten how to end. That morning it hung in the air like a hymn half sung, draped over rooftops and cloisters, misting the shoulders of statues too proud to bow. I had woken before the alarm, not through energy or anticipation, but simply because sleep had retreated in its usual quiet surrender. The flat was colder than expected for May. I didn't draw the curtains. I rarely did. There's something faintly dishonest about people who seal themselves from a world that continues regardless. Let the city look in if it wishes. I have little to hide. Less as the years pass. I made coffee in the chipped blue pot I've never replaced and stared through the unfiltered pane at a world slightly blurred. That was when I noticed it. An envelope beneath the door, slightly buckled with damp along one edge. No stamp, no handwriting, no marks of any kind. It didn't hum with menace or promise. It simply lay there, undesiring of attention. I took it in hand and opened it with the point of a butter knife, already prepared for disappointment. Another charity appeal, perhaps, or one of those strange invitations from theological reading groups that confuse me with someone else. Instead, it was a map, a single sheet, folded once, watercolor paper, thick-grained, and faintly scented with tobacco and something older, linseed oil, perhaps. The map depicted Oxford, but not as I knew it. The river curled too tightly. Certain colleges were misnamed. A lane that should have ended at the Ashmolean curled upward into a street I've never walked. And there, drawn delicately in sepia at the northern edge of the map, was a curtain, not as a symbol, but as object. The words, "Behind here lies memory," had been inked in the corner. That was all. I stood for a while with the thing in my hands, not studying it so much as letting it breathe against the quiet. It didn't frighten me. Morse, Lewis would have said, "You do know someone's having you on." And I'd nod, distantly as if I agreed. I rarely do. People don't go to the trouble of ink and map parchment for jokes, not anymore. I left the map on the desk beside my unopened Times and stared at the crossword instead. Clue 4 down. Veil drawn from memory, revealing truth underneath. 7. Too obvious. I penciled in curtain and then immediately doubted myself. The puzzle always knew more than it let on. A false clue, perhaps. An echo of something else. It was not until I was halfway through my second coffee that I noticed the scorched edge, barely visible, but there, a faint blackening at the bottom left corner of the map, as if it had once been near flame. The paper curled minutely where the heat had caught. I lifted the sheet again, tilted it toward the light, and then I saw it. A name faint as breath, F. Morgan, written not in the same ink, and certainly not by the same hand. Felix Morgan. The name struck a chord, but not one immediately identifiable. A music lecturer? Number? Theology? Closer, but still off-key. I left the question there, unforced, like a note suspended. The best answers, I've found, arrive when not summoned. I dressed without particular urgency, though I admit the day had begun to press against me with that quiet insistence it reserves for things unsaid. The map went into the inside pocket of my coat. I didn't yet know why. Outside the rain continued, steady, unargumentative, the sort of weather that makes umbrellas seem performative. I walked past Keble, its brick face unreadable as always, and paused beneath a plane tree whose leaves had already begun to tarnish. I thought of the curtain again, of what lay behind it, and of how few people, really, wish to look. Third Quad has always struck me as a place that forgets itself. Not in the romantic, crumbling way tourists like to think. no ivy-draped nostalgia or corners brimming with sentiment. Just a quiet refusal to be memorable. The sort of place you pass through on the way to somewhere else, a place that wouldn't expect to hold a death. But that morning, it did. The call came from Lewis, naturally, a slight tightness in his voice that suggested this was not another report of a mislaid bicycle or academic disagreement turned theatrical. He didn't tell me the name right away, just that there'd been an incident, college rooms, a professor found by the scout. I knew before he finished. Felix Morgan, theology then, that was the chord. A mind once considered brilliant, though I remember thinking at the time that the adjective had gathered too much dust in its corners. He'd lectured on Apocrypha and intellectual doubt, two topics he'd treated as largely interchangeable. His was a mind that had grown suspicious of its own brilliance. I always rather liked him for that. We reached the college just before 11. The rain, thinner now, had pooled in the creases of the stone steps. A gull watched us from the balustrade, indifferent, like most sentinels in Oxford. Morgan's rooms were up a narrow stair with steps worn smooth, like thoughts repeated too often. The porter met us at the threshold, his voice low, unnecessarily reverent. He said the scout had come in early, worried because the bins hadn't been put out. It was always that sort of thing in the end. Something domestic. Something no one intends as a clue. The room was unremarkable, books, papers, the residue of a half-lived life. A desk covered in lecture notes he'd never give. On the floor beside the armchair, an empty glass and a bottle of Glenfiddich, older than the student union president. And Morgan himself, slumped, slightly sideways, as though listening to something from far away. His eyes were half closed, the sort of expression people describe as peaceful, though I've never found death to resemble peace. At best, it's the absence of an argument. The window beside him was open. Curtains torn from the rail and puddled on the floor. Rain had drifted in, darkening a patch of the rug. I crouched beside the fallen fabric. The hem was frayed, threads tangled, as if someone had yanked it down in frustration, or perhaps ceremony. The symbolism was unsubtle. Morgan had once written an article on the metaphor of veils in early Christian mysticism. I remembered vaguely a line about what lies beyond revelation, being not light, but silence. There was no note, no final message, no epigram. A man so obsessed with obscure truths might have chosen to end without one. But I couldn't quite believe it. There's always some echo, however faint. Lewis was talking to the scout, sharp-featured woman with a ring of keys like armor at her waist. She said the curtains had been intact yesterday afternoon. And the bottle, it wasn't his. Morgan drank sherry, never whiskey. Too harsh for him, she said, made his throat flare up. She said it plainly, and I wrote it down. Before leaving, I moved once more through the room, letting my eye unfocus. That's often when the shape of things begins to emerge. Something was missing, though I couldn't yet name it. Like a line left unsaid in a verse you thought you knew by heart. Later, I sat at the turf with a pint and the crossword folded beside me. 11 across, the final curtain, 5. I filled in death too tidy, too inevitable. I scratched it out. Instead, I wrote Morse and folded the paper again, slowly, as though it had said too much. There is a stillness in the Bodleian's lower stacks that resists conversation. Not in the way of libraries generally, where silence is the rule, but in the deeper sense that speech itself feels sacrilegious. Even whispers betray the dust. The stones beneath your feet have memorized the weight of scholars now long dead. And in that cloistered hush I met her, Lena Cartwright. I remember the shape of her name before the sound, angular like her handwriting, which I'd glimpsed earlier that morning in a monograph she'd edited on apocryphal epistles. She moved like someone who had never quite learned to enter a room, only to arrive within it, already mid-thought. I found her cross-legged on the floor between two columns of forgotten theology, a stack of manuscripts flanking her like a broken altar. She looked up at me without surprise, as though she had expected me for weeks. She spoke before I did. He wasn't a well man, you know, Felix. Not for some time. But he was still trying to find it, whatever it was. A sentence folded itself between her fingers as she turned a vellum page. She gestured to the parchment beside her. Marginalia, she said. Notes he believed weren't his own. The ink was older than the manuscript. She tilted it toward me, and I saw the faint shadow of a line, curtain drawn, not to conceal but to survive, written in a hand that felt both precise and exhausted. She tucked a lock of hair behind one ear, said he'd become obsessed with the idea that truth had been deliberately obscured in Scripture, not misinterpreted, but quietly hidden by those who thought it too dangerous to survive exposure. I asked if he'd said who he thought had done the hiding. She smiled, just said they wore gowns and sang hymns in minor keys. There was a page, she said, that Felix had shown her once, not long ago, from his own journal, but when she saw it again after his death, the page had changed or been replaced. The words weren't his. She said this with the detached precision of someone accustomed to footnotes. I asked if she'd kept a copy. She shook her head, but I remember the sentence, "Maps are not for finding places, they're for proving you were lost." I looked at her again then, properly. The tone of someone who once believed a man too clever to be wrong, and too proud to admit when he was. I asked whether she had loved him. She didn't answer, but the question made her still. Her fingers rested on the spine of a book without a title. She said she'd once been named in his will, then removed. Then, strangely, invited back for supper a week before he died. She described it as polite, almost ritualistic. He'd asked questions but offered nothing. Poured her sherry but drank only water. I asked about the curtain. She blinked once, then said she didn't believe in symbols, only patterns, and the pattern, she said, was that Felix had begun to write again. After years of silence, that meant something. He hadn't planned to die, at least not that night. On my way out, I paused beside the archive's card index. A drawer stuck slightly as if resistant to being opened. Inside, a single card, misfiled. I slid it free. A catalogue entry from 1941, map, Oxonia, revised overlay. Curtain room reference only, no corresponding record, no date of removal. I placed it in my pocket. The drawer slid shut with a sigh. Back outside, the rain had paused, as though the sky, too, was listening. I made a note in my book. Beneath Lena Cartwright's name, I drew a simple line, then another, crossing it. A mistake, perhaps, but sometimes the shape is all that matters. It was Lewis who mentioned the shop. He'd said it casually, in that way he reserves for details he suspects might matter more to me than they ought to. Said Morgan had been seen near the covered market the week before he died, speaking to a man who kept a shop that sold old maps and not much else. Holloway and Lines tucked behind the bakery between a tobacconist and a hairdresser that had not changed its wallpaper since Churchill's second term. The sort of place you only find when you're looking for something you never quite name. The shop smelled of foxed paper and windowless decades, air stale enough to remember secrets. The proprietor was a slight man with a slow voice, as if each syllable had to be coaxed out from a drawer beneath the counter. He said his name was Holloway. that he had inherited the shop from his father, who'd once made reproductions for dons too proud to carry photocopies. Felix Morgan had been in, yes. Asked about a particular map. Medieval overlay of Oxford 14th century, with margins left wide enough for annotation, paid in advance but never collected it. The man's eyes flicked to a drawer behind him as he said it, and I didn't need to look to know the map was gone. I asked if anyone else had inquired after the same map. He hesitated, and then said there had been another man, weeks earlier, taller, uncertain, spoke with a slight northern accent, asked questions but bought nothing. Holloway said he thought it odd at the time. Not many people ask about overlays unless they're trying to hide something beneath them. I asked to see the customer ledger. He frowned, not with defiance, but with the worry of someone who'd misplaced a particular kind of order. He opened a thick book bound in cracked leather and paged through with the reverence of someone touching old wounds. Morgan's name appeared, circled faintly in pencil. No date, no initials beside it, just a tick, nothing more. But there was another entry, further up, for a C. Kingsley, noted in the same hand, though that name had been crossed out in red. Crossing out in red has always struck me as a private betrayal. I asked if Holloway remembered Kingsley. He shook his head and turned away, rearranging a stack of atlases as if their weight might anchor the room. I let the silence stretch, then thanked him and left. The bell above the door didn't ring. Outside, the rain had returned in slender, diagonal slants. I walked slowly through the market, past stalls selling nothing Morgan would have eaten, past a florist who was closing early and a child asking for coins in a dialect I couldn't place. I stopped in a small courtyard, watching as water ran down a bronze plaque, too worn to read. Beneath my coat, I unfolded the map I'd received that morning. It was not the same as the one Holloway described. This one was hand-drawn, the lines less precise, but in the upper right quadrant, where St. John's should have been, there was a smudge carefully inked over. And in the bottom corner, a line had been added in faint pencil. Turn curtain-wise and the stones will forget. I traced the word curtain-wise with my finger, an invented direction, a private compass. It wasn't a place Morgan had been trying to find. It was a direction he was trying to unmake. That evening, I tried the crossword again. 3 down, 1 who charts loss, not land, 3. I wrote man, then changed it to map, then back again. Some questions resist orientation. There's something about wartime Oxford that lingers, like smoke in old upholstery. You smell it in stairwells when the light has gone, in the stone that refuses to warm, not just memory, but the architecture of forgetting. The city once wore blackout curtains like mourning veils. Some never came. Down. The letter came folded inside a collection of Morgan's papers, found by Lewis in a manila folder with no label, tucked behind lecture notes on ecclesiastical revisionism. Faded blue ink, stiff with decades. The handwriting was unmistakably Morgan's, but the recipient had been redacted, quite literally, a single thick line of black across the name, done not with ink, but soot. A strange choice, and an imprecise one. Beneath it, the outline of the first initial survived. An H, possibly, or an A left open. The letter was dated 1941. Wartime rationing is already in place. Morgan would have been 20, perhaps 21, still fresh-faced and sure that knowledge could outpace violence. The letter spoke of something he called Operation Cuthbert, a phrase I'd never heard, though the name sat oddly on the page, like an actor miscast in his own story. The sentence that followed was stranger still. They say the curtain room is to be bricked tomorrow. The map must never hang again. The capitalization was deliberate. Lewis, ever grounded, had asked whether curtain room was code. I said nothing, but the idea lodged itself beneath my ribs. There was a theatre hall on Morgan's college grounds, long since repurposed, but still bearing a frieze above the door. Veritas et Vox, truth and voice. A performance space once, now used, as most such rooms are, for storage and neglect. I visited just before dusk, when the air begins to draw itself inward. The porter gave me a set of keys without fuss, said no one had used the room in years. It smelled of paraffin, folded wood, and resignation. Stacked chairs formed a crooked skyline, a roll of old scenery canvas slumped against the wall. But it was the curtain I saw first, thick, once red velvet now dulled to the colour of old blood. It hung not across a stage, but against the back wall, floor to ceiling, behind a warped upright piano and an old projector. No rail, no visible mechanism, as though it had been nailed there not to hide anything, but to keep it in. I moved closer and touched the hem. A singed line ran across its lower edge, as if a candle or match had been held there too long. The fabric was stiff, brittle. I imagined Morgan, 20 and unready, standing in this same spot, wondering whether the truth required performance or silence. I pulled the curtain aside. There was only wall, plaster cracked and painted twice in different whites, but something in the centre, faint pencil markings, like the outline of a square. Measured again, then left uncut. Below it, almost invisible unless one crouched and tilted their head, a single word scrawled sideways: echo. I stayed there a long time, tracing the line with a fingertip. It didn't yield meaning, not then, but it refused to leave me. Back in my flat, I unfolded the map again, looked not at the places, but at the spaces between them, at the curtain drawn on paper, the strange reappearance of symmetry where none should have been. Something wasn't being concealed. It was being contained. That night's crossword offered, not drawn for the theatre, but for the mind, 7. I penciled in curtain. Then, quietly, I erased it. There's a particular sort of dust that collects on college archives. Not the domestic kind that lifts at a sneeze, but a finer, greyer veil, more like time itself, settling where it's no longer wanted. Lewis handed me the envelope without ceremony, though I could tell from the pinched corner of his mouth that he'd read what was inside. He'd found it in a cardboard box during a routine comb through the college secretary's back room, an errand I hadn't asked him to run, but one I was quietly grateful he had. The photograph was faded, almost sepia now, but the faces had endured. 12 men at a long table, robes loose, expressions stiff. The backdrop was unmistakably the old refectory, before its remodel, and the date scrawled on the back in blue-black ink confirmed what the angle of the haircuts had already suggested. 1941. War-shadowed, a generation still trying to convince itself it would survive its own theories. Felix Morgan sat third from the right, younger than I'd ever imagined him, still too broad in the face. His gaze not at the camera, but just past it, a detail I'd almost missed. And beside him, a man I recognized from an MY5 file I'd glimpsed in another lifetime. Gregory Tunstall, classic scholar, later exposed as a courier for Soviet contacts, executed in Prague in '61. And then there was the circle. Someone, long after the photograph was taken, had taken a graphite pencil and drawn a faint circle around a face further down the table. Not Morgan, not Tunstall, a third man, thinner, darker, unremarkable in posture. I studied him for longer than I should have. There was something wrong, not with the man himself, but with the edges of him. A faint dissonance, like music, slightly off-key, as though he had been drawn in. I showed the image to Lena Cartwright the next afternoon. She stared at it without speaking. Her fingers, pale and unreadable, touched the edge of the circle but didn't follow it. I asked whether she knew who the man was. She said the name might be Frederick Havelock, but she wasn't sure. She said Felix had mentioned someone once, years ago, who had disappeared after the war, not because of disgrace or death, but because he had agreed to be forgotten. I asked her again about the journal page, the one that had changed. She didn't deny it this time, said she'd rewritten the original line because the original had been incoherent, rambling. She used the word drunken, but something in her voice betrayed that it hadn't been meant as insult. I asked what the line had originally said. She paused, then murmured something I nearly missed. The curtain was drawn too tightly. I suffocated behind it, but they called it sanctuary. I asked who they were. She didn't answer, just placed the photograph on the table between us as if it were a failed poem. I left shortly after. Oxford had turned colder in the hours I'd been indoors. Or perhaps I had. At home, I poured a whiskey I didn't want and sat with the photo again. I stared until the edges blurred, and then something shifted. The man in the circle, Havelock, or whoever he was, had no shadow. Or rather, he did, but it fell differently from the others. A marginal difference. Enough to suggest he had been inserted later, perhaps not physically, not cut and pasted, but chosen. Circled to tell a story Morgan had needed someone else to hear. I folded the image away. That night's crossword offered something oddly familiar. 5 down, false memory, drawn in grey, 7. I penciled in phantom, and then, after a moment, replaced it with forgery. The difference, I suppose, is whether the lie is meant for you, or by you. There's always one. A room no one uses, not locked or barricaded or hidden by any design, but quietly abandoned, passed each day and never entered. Perhaps it was once a rehearsal space or a reading room or a place where things were stored until someone forgot what they were for. Memory gathers in such places, and sometimes so does everything else. I found the reference in a line from one of Morgan's lecture transcripts, a throwaway aside during a seminar on Gnostic paradox. He had said, half to himself, as if truth could be boxed up and stowed like old scenery in the organ room nobody uses. The line wasn't in the published version, but it appeared in a marginal note written, I think, for himself, or someone who had stopped listening. The old organ room lay beneath the chapel, beyond a corridor that smelled faintly of polish and vanished footsteps. I had to ask the porter twice before he admitted it was still accessible. Said he didn't think anyone had used it since the choir moved to a digital keyboard, the phrase sounding to him like both progress and sacrilege. The key took some coaxing. Inside, the air was colder than expected, with a thin metallic tang, the sort that clings to forgotten brass. The pipes still loomed above, dust-veiled and mute, like something sacred held in contempt. The light switch didn't work. I used my torch, though it felt like an intrusion. The far wall had been repainted once, badly, a square patch lighter than the rest. Beside it, a wooden screen leaned at an angle, its frame warped by damp. A single chair sat under the window, half-shadowed and wholly indifferent. But what drew my attention was not the room itself, but the carpet beneath the screen. A subtle impression, too subtle for anyone uninterested in furniture legs and their placements. One chair had been there, certainly, but a second shadow told of another, not recently, but not decades ago either. I crouched and ran my fingers along the baseboard behind it. Dust fell reluctantly, and then I felt it. A crack, thin and deliberate, like the edge of a panel. hidden not by craftsmanship but disinterest. Behind the panel, a crawl space, just large enough for a man to kneel in. The air stale and weighty. I reached in and found the remnants of a life once private. An empty ink bottle, a pair of wire-framed glasses, and a theatre programme folded so many times it felt like cloth. I opened it carefully. Curtain Room Productions, 1941, The Last Light. The cast list meant nothing. But one name had been underlined in blue pencil, F. Morgan, not as actor, not as director, but listed simply as stage door. There had been meetings here, that much was clear, discussions that didn't merit minutes, a curtain drawn again, and this time not of velvet but of silence. I closed the panel and stepped back into the full room. The organ pipes groaned softly in the wind, or perhaps they didn't. Perhaps that was something else. Back in my flat, I poured myself a whiskey and turned the programme in my hands. On the back, a quote, unattributed, scrawled in unfamiliar ink. The truth must be staged to be heard, but someone must be there to close the curtain. The crossword lay half-finished beside me. 8 across. Hidden performance, unseen by design, 9. I stared at it for a long time before writing in rehearsal. Then, in smaller script beside it, added, confession. And neither felt quite wrong. It was the voice that returned to me first, not the words, just the cadence. A clipped uncertainty, like someone assembling sentences in real time, unsure whether the room would hold them. It had emerged in Lena's retelling, buried beneath her careful detachment. A memory of a voice overheard in the corridor outside the organ room in what she insisted was late March. She said she'd dismissed it at the time. Regret wears many coats, but that morning she wore none at all. She'd said the voice didn't belong to Morgan, though it was male, and that it had been joined by another, a woman's, soft but clipped, almost whispered. The conversation had lasted only minutes. She remembered the man saying something about the page, and the woman replying, "Then burn it properly this time." But it was the sound, not the sentence, that seemed to have stayed with her. She said it reminded her of poor Latin. That was the phrase, and not a poor Latin accent, not bad pronunciation, but poor Latin, as though the voice itself had misdeclined. I took that with me as I walked towards St. Anne's Home for retired college staff, where the porter, I'd been told, now lived out his days in peace, if not clarity. His name was Preston, and he had served during Morgan's early years, a small, neat man with a moustache-like punctuation. The home smelled faintly of overboiled cabbage and disinfectant, as most places of long memory do. Preston greeted me with a smile that held, for the briefest moment, recognition. I said I was looking into Professor Morgan's death. He nodded, slowly, as if that confirmed something he'd long expected. I asked if he remembered people coming and going from the chapel rooms late at night. He thought. Then said there were 2, once, who used to meet in the hallway near the organ room, not often, and never with ceremony. He said one of them always arrived first. A woman with a cough, dry, persistent, like dust caught in curtain folds. The man came after. He had a stiff walk and always apologized for nothing in particular, said he spoke funny, like someone rehearsing their own opinion. Preston didn't remember names, but he recalled that the man wore a ring, not a wedding, but academic, silver with some crest, and that his voice rose slightly at the end of every phrase, as if questioning its own authority. Like a teacher who doesn't quite believe the answer's right, he'd said. Then he frowned and muttered something I didn't catch. I asked if he remembered what they talked about. He shook his head, just that they never stayed long, and that once, after they'd left, he found a page torn from a notebook in the corridor. Not discarded, folded, as though it had been meant to be left behind. He hadn't kept it. Said he wasn't the sort to meddle. But he remembered one word in it. Curtain. Always the curtain. I left him with thanks and a soft handshake, and walked back through the rain-slicked streets, the city seeming to withdraw behind its own breath. The memory of the ring stayed with me. I hadn't noticed one on Kingsley, but that meant little. There was something else. A hesitation, a gesture, perhaps when I'd first asked about Morgan. A glance downward, not shame, but preparation. I hadn't recorded it then, I did now. At home, I turned over the day's crossword. 4 down, a voice that doubts its own truth. 6. I paused, considered echo, then quaver, then accent. None quite fit. Eventually I wrote timber, a spelling I knew was wrong, but sounded right. The radio was playing Schubert again, one of those minor key adagios that seemed to unravel something behind the eyes rather than in front of them. I didn't turn it off. It seemed to know better than I did how the morning would unfold. Outside, the streets were thin with light, that wan mid-autumn colour that feels too tired to commit to anything. Oxford was dozing, or pretending to. I returned to the photograph. I'd stared at it for days, but it was the opera records, not the image, that offered the first shift. Morgan had kept them alphabetically, but the last 6 had been reordered. Don Giovanni beside Fidelio, followed by the Rake's Progress, and then 3 unlabelled sleeves. It was the sort of detail I wouldn't have noticed if I hadn't been reaching for something else. A pen, I think, and knocked them slightly out of place. One sleeve had a small tear on the edge, revealing a scrap of paper inside. Not a recording note. A crossword clue. It was handwritten in Morgan's familiar, untidy scrawl, but coded in a way that suggested he hadn't meant it to be solved in haste. 8 clues, all thematically linked by music and direction. Phrases like step down from the 5th to meet a lie in 4 parts, 7, and turn left at silence to find the truth in rehearsal 6. Not standard fare, and not for publication. This was a message dressed as a puzzle. I laid them out beside his map, the one still faintly scorched. I began to align the answers with college landmarks, letting instinct stand in for certainty. One clue, Echo's twin heard backwards in stone, 5, led me to the cloisters near Balliol, where I once watched a student shout into the corner just to hear himself disobey physics. Another clue pointed elsewhere, rest between the flats, where old brass sings 6. The organ room, no doubt, but it was the 7th clue that fixed me. To see what's erased, write again where the air forgets. 8. The phrasing struck me not for its cleverness, but for its tone. It read like resignation, like a man who had already rewritten something more than once, hoping to see what had vanished. I turned back to the theatre programme from the curtain room. Folded inside was a cast list with initials, not names, something I hadn't noticed before. FM was easy. But 3 others appeared more than once, CK, LC, and HHCK, likely Kingsley. LC, Lena, surely. HH, the third person in the photograph, or someone else. I recalled the forgery. Lena had admitted to replacing the line, but had she done so alone? Had she been rewriting just the journal? Or the story itself? I needed fresh air. I walked to the river, the sky dragging its sleeves across the treetops, and thought again of Morgan's peculiar obsession with overlays. Not maps, not even messages, but performances layered across real time. Every document is a palimpsest. Every clue is a rehearsal. The forgery wasn't a cover-up, it was a restaging. Back at my desk, the Times crossword waited, half done, 11 across, written again, seen clearer, 8. I wrote a revised version, crossed it out, tried redrawn, then restaged, all wrong. Then I saw the music sleeve again, the one labelled in pencil, C minor, number 3, and realised it didn't refer to a key but a movement, something that needed to be repeated to be understood, played quietly, then played again. I filled in the clue with rehearse, and wondered, not for the first time, who was watching. It is a peculiar cruelty of memory that one rarely recalls the finality of a thing until it begins again. A curtain doesn't fall once, it falls twice, first for the audience, and then later, somewhere quieter, when no one is watching. That second fall is the one that matters, the private ending, the one you don't rehearse. I asked them to meet in the old chapel, not for theatrical effect. I've never had the stomach for that sort of indulgence, but because it was the only room that still smelled faintly of velvet and fear. The organ had not been tuned in years, and its silence served me better than any tone. Lena arrived first. Her eyes, usually steady, betrayed a sleeplessness not of fatigue, but of restraint. She greeted me with a nod and no expectation of warmth. Kingsley followed, 5 minutes behind. His coat was too new. A faint scent of clove hung around him, and he adjusted his cuff twice in the first minute. I'd watched him lecture once, years ago, a man who relied on conviction to mask the faint echo of his own doubt. There was no ceremony. I placed the photograph on the table between us. The circle around the face had faded further. Graphite has no loyalty to time. I asked them who H.H. was. Kingsley looked puzzled, which didn't suit him. Lena looked bored. Said the name meant nothing. I didn't believe her, and I think she knew it. I produced the journal fragment next, the one she'd admitted rewriting. Asked her again why. She said Felix had asked her to protect someone, she hadn't known who, but after his death she'd made an assumption that it was Kingsley. Kingsley didn't flinch, said he had no secrets worth hiding. I told him about the organ room, the crawl space, the old program. His name, or at least his initials, scrawled beside Morgan's in a cast list no one had seen in 70 years. Said I'd spoken with Preston, the retired porter, who remembered a man with a ring, a woman with a cough, and the faint scent of guilt folded into a conversation they thought no one would remember. Kingsley's voice caught then. He said he had only ever tried to help Felix, that Felix had become disoriented, that his talk of maps and hidden performances had tipped into something untethered. Said he'd tried to destroy the journal pages not to erase the truth, but to prevent Felix's legacy from curdling into nonsense. That he had not known the ink was poisoned. It was Lena who asked the question that had been forming quietly in my own mind. How do you poison ink? Kingsley looked at her then properly. Said he hadn't. That someone else must have retrieved the page after he discarded it. That someone had taken Morgan's obsession and given it weight, shape, consequence. I asked him about Holloway, the cartographer. He went very still. Said he didn't know the name, but his voice, the timbre of it, dropped a note. The sort of note only a choir boy would hear, or someone used to listening for breath between verses. I let it go. They left in opposite directions. That evening I sat in the theatre hall, alone. The curtain, once so imperious, now hung unevenly. The hem sagged. The dust at its base had been disturbed recently, and I noticed something curious, a thread, gold in colour, snagged at the bottom corner. Stage thread. Not from this curtain, but another. Perhaps one sewn into a costume, perhaps not. The crossword that night asked, Truth's final act, performed twice, 7. I wrote a curtain. Then below it, reprise, and wondered which one we were still in. The trouble with ink is that it pretends to be permanent. A lie pressed into fibre. A stain that claims endurance but fades all the same. You only have to look at an old college ledger or a love letter left too close to sunlight to see it, the way truth, once written, begins to vanish on its own. That morning I returned to Holloway's shop. The bell above the door still didn't ring, and the air inside was damp with unsold time. He was behind the counter, rearranging tubes of parchment that didn't need it. He looked up and smiled too early. I placed the folded map on the glass. The scorched one, the one with Felix's handwriting in its margins. Said I'd noticed something odd in the ink. Asked what he thought of the line about turning curtain-wise. He read it once, then a second time, this time aloud, the words lingering like dust off a closed stage. He said it was strange phrasing, that Morgan was always a little theatrical. Perhaps it was a metaphor. I didn't speak. Just opened my notebook and showed him the bottle cap I'd found beneath the crawlspace panel in the organ room. The cap still bore a smudge of dark brown, the last of the ink, maybe. Or something more final. I asked what kind of ink he sold. He began to answer, the usual things, iron gall, sepia, walnut. But I was watching his hands. One had a faint stain on the middle finger, near the cuticle, the kind that doesn't come from handling bottles, but from writing. He asked whether Felix had written something dangerous. I said not in words. He asked whether it was the ink that had killed him. I said yes. He didn't deny it, just nodded once. Said that his father had shown him how, years ago, a compound meant for diplomats, not scholars. Tincture of belladonna and iron activated by heat. Invisible in small amounts, harmless unless used on dry parchment, and traced over again. He said Felix had come to him with questions, not suspicion. That he'd wanted a map, re-inked with something that would last. Something private. Something not printed by machines. And that Felix had grown obsessed with the notion that parts of Oxford had been deliberately misrepresented on official records during the war. That the maps had lied. That the curtain room had never been a room at all, but a designation, a performance, a distraction. Holloway said he hadn't planned to hurt him, but that something had shifted when Felix began threatening to publish, to name, to draw the past too sharply. Said he didn't want his father's name implicated. That history is best left blurred. I asked him who else knew. He said no one. I didn't believe him, but it was the kind of untruth I could live with, the sort that only harms when exposed too quickly. I left without the map. It belonged to him now. That evening I sat alone in the Radcliffe camera, where the heating clicked in the corners and the lamps hummed faintly with effort. I'd brought an old score, Bach, for no reason but order, and the day's crossword untouched. 6 down, drawn to be forgotten, and so remembered. 5. I wrote inked, then erased, then finally ghost, and underlined it once. Softly. I returned to the theatre just after dusk, the city breathing slowly beneath its wet stone. The curtain had not moved, still stained, still bowed by time, still guarding whatever version of history it had once promised to obscure. The room was colder than I remembered, though that may have been something internal. Curtains preserve temperature, they say, and secrets but not truth. Never trust. Lewis had asked, earlier that day, whether I'd be writing a report. I said yes, though I didn't know for whom. Some endings aren't meant for paper. Some truths arrive too late for procedure. The curtain parted easily now. The velvet, long worn, no longer resisted touch. Behind it, the wall remained bare. No hidden door, no inscription, just plaster and flaking paint. And yet it was here, more than anywhere, that Felix Morgan had chosen to return, not physically, but in thought, in a gesture, in ink. The map which Holloway had drawn under commission still hung in the back office of the shop, though he would no longer acknowledge its authorship. Said it had simply appeared one morning unsigned, a gift or a joke. I left it there. Some objects do not benefit from movement. What mattered wasn't the map. It had never been. What mattered were the corrections, the overlays. The faint lines are redrawn over erasures, visible only in angled light. I'd visited the archive again that afternoon, under the pretense of reviewing war-era renovation plans. The librarian had nodded with the weariness of someone accustomed to strange men chasing ghosts through catalogues. Among the old floor plans, I found what I had half hoped not to. A blueprint for a structure labelled simply CRM, not curtain room, as Morgan had insisted, but the conferral room, a wartime designation, temporary, windowless, used for classified briefings, and then sealed. The location matched the organ room. It had never been a rehearsal space or a hiding place. It had been a stage of sorts, but one used not for performance, but preparation, for decisions made in hushed voices, the staging of silence. Morgan had tried to resurrect it piece by piece from his memory and from the fragments left behind in the minds of those too careful to speak plainly. Lena, Kingsley, even Holloway. They had all known something, not everything, but enough to feel the heat of proximity. And that was what had killed him in the end. Not ink, not betrayal, but a closeness to truth that had outlived its welcome. I sat in the back row of the theatre, alone, letting the curtain settle back into its folds. Somewhere in the building, a radiator ticked like a metronome. On the floor beside me lay the last crossword Morgan had begun. Creased, incomplete, the ink, beginning to feather into the paper. I traced a clue with my finger, 7 across, drawn line between fact and fable, 4. I wrote mark. Then, more carefully, edge. Neither held. Eventually I circled the clue once. Then I folded the paper shut. I walked back through the empty corridors, the light now fully gone. Rain against the windows. Stone beneath the soles. Nothing definitive, but something close to stillness. Enough. I passed the chapel, its doors closed, and paused before the notice board. An old flyer, curled at the corners, announced a long-finished production. The Last Light. Directed by someone whose name had faded. But beneath it, in pencil, someone had written a line. A stage direction, perhaps, or a warning, exit left, curtain-wise, no punctuation, no signature, just instruction, and so I did.